One bank financed Nazi Germany while simultaneously funding the Allied war effort. The same bank that helped build America's railroads also orchestrated coups in foreign nations. Its partners didn't just control money. They controlled presidents, intelligence agencies, and the very structure of American power. Brothers Harriman managed over $4 trillion in assets at its peak. That's more than the GDP of Germany. But the real number that matters, 15. That's how many BBH partners were members of Skull and Bones, Yale's secret society. The same society that produced 3 presidents, countless CIA directors, and Supreme Court justices. What nobody talks about is the meeting room. A single room at 59 Wall Street where decisions were made that shaped 2 world wars, created the CIA, and determined which countries would rise or fall. No minutes were recorded, no outsiders allowed. Just partners bound by oaths older than the bank itself. This wasn't just about making money. J.P. Morgan was about money. Goldman Sachs was about money. Brothers Harriman was about something far more valuable: control. While other banks competed for clients, BBH selected them. While competitors fought for market share, BBH shaped the markets themselves. They didn't follow American foreign policy. They wrote it. Their partners weren't just advisors to presidents. They were the presidents. The Rothschilds controlled European finance. The Rockefellers dominated oil. But Brothers Harriman, they controlled the people who controlled everything else. Here's what makes this story different. When the bank's Nazi connections were exposed in 1942, nothing happened. When documents revealed their role in overthrowing governments, the files were classified for 70 years. When journalists tried to investigate, sources disappeared. Evidence vanished. Stories died. The bank still exists today, still operating from the shadows, still private, still powerful, and still connected to Yale's most notorious secret society. This is the story of how a bank became the invisible hand guiding American power for 2 centuries. By 1931, Brothers Harriman had become the largest private bank in America. Their partners' combined wealth exceeded $500 million, about $9 billion in today's money. They financed the Union Pacific Railroad, backed Standard Oil, and held enough government bonds to influence federal policy. But the real power wasn't in their vaults. It was in their partnerships. What most people don't know is that BBH operated under a different set of rules than every other bank on Wall Street. While public companies answered to shareholders, BBH answered to no one. While competitors filed public disclosures, BBH kept its operations completely private. While other banks had hundreds of employees, BBH maintained a lean structure where 15 senior partners made every major decision. These weren't ordinary bankers. Averell Harriman became ambassador to the Soviet Union, then governor of New York. Prescott Bush became a U.S. senator and father to a president, grandfather to another. Robert Lovett became Secretary of Defense. E. Roland Harriman chaired the board of directors for 20 major corporations simultaneously. Behind the wealth and political power was a common thread that connected them all: Yale University's Skull and Bones Society. Founded in 1832, Skull and Bones wasn't just a college fraternity. It was a selection mechanism, a loyalty test, and a lifelong network that placed its members in positions of extraordinary influence. Let me take you back to where this really began. The year was 1818. Alexander Brown, an Irish linen merchant, established a banking house in Baltimore. Nothing unusual about that. Dozens of merchant banks operated in American port cities. But Alexander Brown did something different. He established branch offices in Liverpool, New York, and Philadelphia, all controlled by his 4 sons. Family control, international reach, complete discretion. By 1825, Brown Brothers was financing the majority of American cotton exports to England. They weren't just moving money. They were moving commodities, information, and political influence across the Atlantic. When the Bank of the United States collapsed in 1836, Brown Brothers stepped in to stabilize American credit in European markets. They became the financial bridge between 2 continents. The Civil War transformed them. While other banks struggled with wartime uncertainty, Brown Brothers thrived. They financed both Union war bonds and Southern cotton shipments to England. Officially, they supported the North. Unofficially, their Liverpool office kept Southern commerce flowing. Profit wasn't partisan. Then came the merger. In 1931, Brown Brothers joined with Harriman Brothers and Company, run by railroad baron E.H. Harriman's sons, Averell and Rowland. The timing was deliberate. America was in the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing. Credit was frozen. But BBH had something competitors didn't: international connections, political access, and a network that transcended national boundaries. The new partnership agreement contained an unusual clause. Partners would share unlimited liability. If the bank failed, they'd lose everything: homes, personal fortunes, family wealth. This wasn't standard practice. Most banks had moved toward limited liability structures, but BBH insisted on total exposure. You see, unlimited liability created something valuable: absolute trust. When partners risk everything together, they don't betray each other. They don't leak information. They don't compete internally. They become a single organism with one objective: protecting the partnership at all costs. What's interesting is who they recruited. BBH didn't hire the smartest graduates from Yale. They hired Skull and Bones members. Not all of them. Only specific ones. The society had about 15 members per class. BBH typically recruited one or two, but over decades, this created something unprecedented: a bank where nearly every senior partner had taken the same oath, undergone the same initiation, and belonged to the same secret network. The Skull and Bones connection wasn't coincidental. It was structural. The society taught its members that they were destined to lead, that conventional rules didn't apply to elites, that loyalty to fellow bonesmen superseded other obligations. These weren't just banking principles. They became BBH's operating philosophy. By 1933, BBH controlled more than just money. Partner Prescott Bush sat on the boards of multiple companies doing business with Nazi Germany. Partner Averell Harriman negotiated directly with Stalin. Partner Robert Lovett advised President Roosevelt on military strategy. They weren't bankers who occasionally dealt with politics. They were political operators who happened to run a bank. But to understand how BBH achieved this unprecedented level of influence, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment when a secret society at Yale decided that its members would control not just their own futures, but America's. The first thing you need to know about Skull and Bones is that it wasn't created by students. It was created by William Huntington Russell in 1832, immediately after he returned from Germany. Russell had spent a year in Berlin, studying at a university where secret societies wielded enormous political power. He came back to Yale with a plan. Russell partnered with Alphonso Taft, yes, future President William Howard Taft's father, to establish what they called the Brotherhood of Death. The skull and crossbones symbol wasn't chosen randomly. It represented mortality, equality in death, and the idea that members were bonded beyond life itself. The society met in a building they called the Tomb. No windows, thick walls, a single entrance. Inside, they built a chamber decorated with human skeletons, Nazi memorabilia added later, and stolen historical artifacts. Geronimo's skull allegedly sat in a glass case. Pancho Villa's bones supposedly lined a shelf. Whether these claims were true mattered less than what they represented. Bonesmen believed they stood above conventional law and morality. Here's what's interesting. 15 members were tapped each year during their junior year at Yale. The selection process was secretive, but patterns emerged. Legacy admissions, sons of existing members, got priority. Athletes who demonstrated leadership received consideration. But the real criteria was something else: potential for power. Skull and Bones didn't want the smartest students. Yale had plenty of brilliant scholars who never received an invitation. They wanted students who would become judges, senators, ambassadors, and corporate leaders. Intelligence helped, but ambition, connections, and ruthlessness mattered more. The initiation ritual bonded members for life. Initiates spent a night in a coffin, confessing their deepest secrets and sexual histories to fellow members. They emerged reborn with new names and absolute loyalty to the society. Every Thursday and Sunday night, members met in the Tomb to discuss their lives, ambitions, and strategies for achieving power. Look, this wasn't just fraternity bonding. This was elite network building at an industrial scale. By 1856, Skull and Bones members controlled Yale's administration. By 1980, they were placing members in federal positions. William Howard Taft became president in 1909. His opponent in the 1912 election, Theodore Roosevelt. Both were bonesmen. The 1960s gave America a choice between John F. Kennedy and… Wait, actually, Kennedy wasn't a bonesman, but his advisors were. The 2004 election featured George W. Bush versus John Kerry, both bonesmen. When asked about their membership during a televised debate, both candidates refused to discuss it. It's a secret, they said, and laughed. Now, here's where Brown Brothers enters the story. James Brown, son of founder Alexander Brown, graduated from Yale in 1841. No record confirms his Skull and Bones membership. The society keeps its roster completely confidential, but his subsequent actions suggest deep connections to the Yale network. He hired exclusively from Yale. He gave preferential financing to Yale-connected businesses. He established a pattern that would define BBH for the next century. By 1860, Brown Brothers had moved its headquarters to New York, specifically to 59 Wall Street. The building became legendary on Wall Street, not for its size, but for its impenetrability. Partners worked in a large common room with a single massive table, no private offices, no secretaries in the room, no phones. When partners needed to discuss sensitive matters, everyone else left. This open partnership model came directly from Skull and Bones practices. The Tomb operated the same way. Members gathered around a table. No hierarchy. Decisions made collectively. Trust wasn't just encouraged. It was mandatory. The Civil War proved the model's value. While other banks struggled to navigate the conflict's political complexities, Brown Brothers used their Yale network to gather intelligence from both sides. They knew which southern plantations would survive, which northern industries would boom, which political leaders would rise. James Brown personally knew Secretary of State William Seward, also suspected of Skull and Bones membership, though unconfirmed. This connection gave Brown Brothers advanced knowledge of government bond issuances, military contracts, and international diplomatic moves. They didn't just react to events, they positioned themselves before events happened. You see, what made this network so powerful wasn't just the connections, it was the secrecy. When two bonesmen met, they could identify each other immediately through specific phrases and gestures. They could speak frankly about intentions other businessmen had to disguise. They could coordinate actions that would appear coincidental to outsiders. Think about it. If you're negotiating a business deal and the person across the table shares your deepest secrets, knows your family, and has sworn a lifetime oath of mutual support, you're not really negotiating. You're coordinating. That's what Skull and Bones provided. Coordination disguised as competition. By 1900, Brown Brothers had become the most politically connected bank in America. They financed McKinley's presidential campaign. They backed railroad expansions that opened the West. They held enough British government bonds to influence exchange rates between pounds and dollars, but they remained completely private. No public stock, no disclosure requirements, no transparency whatsoever. When journalists asked about the bank's operations, partners declined to comment. When regulators requested information, BBH provided only what was legally mandated, and sometimes not even that. The bank operated in a gray zone between legitimate business and something else entirely. The partnership agreement, rewritten in 1902, contained a clause that would shock modern lawyers. Partners agreed that all disputes would be settled internally. No partner could sue another partner. No partner could speak publicly about bank operations. Violation meant complete financial destruction. The partnership would seize all of the violator's assets, including personal property and family trusts. This wasn't just a business agreement. It was omertà, the mafia code of silence, applied to American finance. What most people miss is that this structure made BBH virtually impossible to investigate or regulate. Government agencies could subpoena documents, but BBH would claim attorney-client privilege or national security concerns. Journalists could ask questions, but partners would simply refuse to answer. Competitors could try to poach talent, but BBH partners earned so much and risked losing so much if they left that defection was unthinkable. The truth was, Brown Brothers had created something unprecedented in American capitalism, a completely private, utterly secretive, politically connected financial institution that operated according to its own rules, and it was just getting started. By 1919, Brown Brothers controlled approximately $250 million in assets, equivalent to roughly $4 billion today. But raw numbers don't capture their real power. They weren't the biggest bank. They were the most connected. Partner Averell Harriman changed everything. His father, E.H. Harriman, had built the Union Pacific Railroad into a transcontinental empire. When E.H. died in 1909, Averell inherited approximately $70 million and a network that spanned continents. He also inherited something else: his father's ruthless approach to business. E.H. Harriman had been known for a specific tactic. He'd identify struggling railroads, offer loans at favorable rates, then insert clauses that gave him control if payments were missed. Within 2 years of issuing a loan, Averell learned this model and applied it to entire countries. Let me explain how this worked. After World War I, Europe was devastated. Germany owed massive reparations. France needed Reconstruction capital. Britain had depleted its gold reserves. American banks saw risk. Averell Harriman saw opportunity. In 1922, Harriman Brothers and Company, not yet merged with Brown Brothers, established a new division focused on international concessions. They didn't just lend money. They negotiated rights to natural resources, transportation infrastructure, and industrial facilities in exchange for capital. The Soviet Union became Harriman's first major target. While most American businessmen viewed Bolshevik Russia as too risky, Harriman saw a resource-rich nation desperate for investment. In 1924, he negotiated a manganese mining concession in Soviet Georgia. The deal gave Harriman Brothers exclusive rights to extract manganese, essential for steel production, for 20 years. Here's what made this move brilliant. Harriman wasn't just mining manganese. He was building a relationship with Soviet leadership, specifically with Stalin's inner circle. He positioned himself as the American business leader most willing to work with the communist regime. This access would prove invaluable for decades. But Harriman didn't stop with the Soviets. In 1926, he established a shipping line connecting New York to Hamburg, Germany. The line's official purpose was commercial cargo. Its unofficial purpose was establishing financial connections with rising German industrial firms, many of which would later become central to the Nazi war machine. You see, Harriman understood something that most bankers missed. Political ideology didn't matter. Communists and fascists both needed capital, technology, and international connections. Whoever provided those things gained leverage regardless of who won ideological battles. The 1931 merger between Brown Brothers and Harriman Brothers created a powerhouse that combined Brown Brothers' century-old connections with Harriman's aggressive international strategy. The new partnership agreement listed 15 senior partners. At least 10 were Skull and Bones members. Partner Prescott Bush, yes, George H.W., Bush's father, joined BBH in 1931. Bush brought something crucial: connections to German industrial firms through his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, who had established a banking relationship with the Thyssen steel empire. Fritz Thyssen was one of Adolf Hitler's earliest financial supporters. Thyssen believed Hitler would destroy German communism and restore industrial profits. Through a complex network of Dutch banking entities, Thyssen funneled money to the Nazi Party throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. BBH managed Thyssen's American interests through a company called Union Banking Corporation, UBC. Prescott Bush served as one of UBC's directors. The relationship was simple. Thyssen's steel empire needed American raw materials and technology. BBH facilitated those transactions, earning fees on both sides. Now, I want to be clear about something. There's no evidence that BBH partners were ideological Nazis or supported Hitler's racial theories. Their motivation was purely financial. Thyssen paid well. German industrial firms needed American resources. BBH made money connecting them. But the ethical implications were obvious even then. By 1933, Hitler had consolidated power. By 1935, Germany had begun rearmament in violation of the Versailles Treaty. By 1938, they'd annexed Austria and were threatening Czechoslovakia. Throughout this period, BBH continued managing Thyssen's American assets. The U.S. government noticed. In 1942, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, federal authorities seized UBC's assets. Prescott Bush's shares were liquidated. The bank's German connections were terminated. But here's what's interesting. No criminal charges were filed. No partners were prosecuted. The matter was handled as a civil asset seizure, not a criminal investigation. Why? The official explanation was that BBH had acted legally until the US entered the war. The unofficial explanation, the one you won't find in official histories, is that BBH partners had become too valuable to prosecute. Look at where they were positioned by 1942. Averell Harriman had become Roosevelt's special envoy to Europe, coordinating Allied supply chains. Robert Lovett was Assistant Secretary of War for Air, overseeing bomber production and deployment. These men weren't just useful to the war effort, they were essential. Prosecuting them would have exposed America's financial elites' extensive pre-war dealings with Nazi Germany. It would have revealed that many major American corporations, not just BBH, had continued doing business with German firms well into the late 1930s. The political damage would have been catastrophic. So a deal was struck. BBH would sever all German connections. Partners would dedicate themselves fully to the Allied war effort. In exchange, investigations would go no further. What most people don't know is how seamlessly BBH pivoted from financing both sides to becoming the financial engine of the American intelligence community. The same networks they built to do business with Soviets and Nazis became channels for espionage, covert operations, and post-war reconstruction. Consider the mechanics. BBH had maintained correspondent relationships with banks in London, Zurich, Buenos Aires, and Shanghai. They had partners who spoke Russian, German, French, and Spanish fluently. They had business relationships with industrialists, politicians, and military leaders across Europe and Asia. When the Office of Strategic Services, OSS precursor to the CIA, needed to establish intelligence networks in occupied Europe, who did they turn to? BBH partners had the contacts, the language skills, and the experience operating in morally ambiguous situations. The bank's structure made them perfect for intelligence work. Remember, unlimited liability meant absolute discretion. Partners couldn't expose each other without destroying themselves. This same principle applied to classified operations. BBH partners could run covert financial operations, knowing that their colleagues would never reveal them. Not to journalists, not to regulators, not even to congressional investigators. By 1945, Brothers Harriman had positioned itself as the indispensable financial institution for America's emerging global empire. They'd survived their Nazi connections. They'd proven their value to the war effort, and they built relationships with the intelligence community that would define the post-war era. The question wasn't whether BBH would dominate post-war American finance. The question was how far that domination would extend. The Yale Club of New York stands at 50 Vanderbilt Avenue, directly across from Grand Central Terminal. On the 22nd floor, in a private room without a name or number, Skull and Bones members have met every month since 1897. The meetings aren't announced. No one takes notes. Attendance is voluntary, but expected. What happens in that room shapes American power more than most congressional hearings. Let me walk you through a typical gathering in 1947. The war has ended. Europe is devastated. The Soviet Union is consolidating control over Eastern Europe. America faces a choice: retreat into isolation or establish global dominance. In that unnamed room, 15 men sit around a mahogany table. Averell Harriman is there, fresh from serving as ambassador to the Soviet Union. Robert Lovett attends, having just left his position as Under-Secretary of State. Prescott Bush participates, representing BBH's financial interests. George H.W. Bush's future CIA director, William Casey, sits nearby, though Casey wasn't actually a bonesman, but he'd cultivated relationships with society members through OSS work. The official topic is reminiscences from the war. The actual discussion covers something far more significant: the structure of American intelligence operations in peacetime. You see, the OSS was being disbanded. President Truman distrusted permanent intelligence agencies, fearing they'd become a Gestapo. But bonesmen in that room knew something Truman didn't. You can't run a global empire without global intelligence. Lovett proposes a solution. Instead of one centralized agency, create a decentralized network. Use private corporations, foundations, and academic institutions as covers for intelligence operations. Fund these entities through front companies. Staff them with reliable people, meaning Skull and Bones members, and trusted associates. This wasn't theoretical planning. This became the blueprint for the CIA, Radio Free Europe, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and dozens of other Cold War entities. The organizational model came directly from how Skull and Bones had operated for over a century: secret membership, lifetime loyalty, and layered cover structures. Here's what made this approach brilliant. When congressional committees investigated CIA activities in later decades, they'd find corporations that happened to employ former intelligence officers. They'd discover foundations funding anti-communist publications, but they'd rarely trace these collections back to their source: coordinated planning by a secret society whose members had placed themselves in positions of strategic control. BBH became central to this network. The bank established trust accounts for foundations that funded Cold War cultural operations. They managed investment portfolios for corporations that served as CIA fronts. They hired ex-intelligence officers into partnership positions, blurring the line between banking and espionage. Partner William Bundy exemplified this convergence. Bundy joined BBH in 1951 after working for the CIA. He'd married Dean Acheson's daughter, Acheson being Secretary of State and a Yale graduate, though apparently not a bonesman. Bundy maintained his CIA security clearance while working at BBH. He'd leave the bank in 1960 to become a key architect of Vietnam War policy. Think about what this means. A BBH partner was simultaneously running banking operations and maintaining active intelligence clearances. He had access to classified information that could affect markets, political outcomes, and investment opportunities. The potential for conflicts of interest was staggering, but it gets more complex. McGeorge Bundy, William's brother, became National Security Advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. McGeorge wasn't a BBH partner, but he was a bonesman. The brothers could coordinate across government and finance without leaving paper trails. When historians later examined Kennedy's foreign policy decision-making, they found numerous instances where financial considerations seemed to drive military and diplomatic choices. BBH financing of anti-Castro operations, BBH involvement in South American industrial projects, BBH management of funds connected to regime change operations. Was this conspiracy? Or was it simply how power actually operates? Informal networks making coordinated decisions that formal institutions later ratify. I want to be precise about something. There's no evidence of a grand conspiracy where Skull and Bones members gathered and decided, let's control America. The reality was more subtle and more powerful. Bonesmen genuinely believed they were uniquely qualified to lead. They'd been selected at age 20, told they were exceptional, and trained to see themselves as natural aristocrats. This wasn't cynical manipulation. It was sincere elitism. They thought their secrecy was necessary. They believed their coordination served the national interest. The problem was that their definition of national interest aligned suspiciously well with their personal interests. Consider the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States gave Western Europe over $13 billion in aid, roughly $150 billion today. The official goal was preventing communist expansion by rebuilding European economies. The unofficial effect was creating massive business opportunities for American banks and corporations. BBH positioned itself at the center of Marshall Plan financing. They didn't receive government contracts directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they provided advisory services to European banks receiving Marshall Plan funds. They facilitated currency exchanges. They structured loans between American manufacturers and European buyers. Every transaction generated fees. More importantly, every transaction generated intelligence about European economic conditions, political developments, and market opportunities. This intelligence flowed back to BBH, to their partners in government, and to their fellow bonesmen positioned throughout corporate America. The network's power wasn't just financial, it was informational. BBH partners knew what was happening in European markets before it became public knowledge. They knew which governments were stable before diplomatic cables confirmed it. They knew which industries would boom before competitors recognized the trends. How? Because their fellow bonesmen were ambassadors, CIA station chiefs, corporate executives, and foundation officers scattered across the globe. They shared information through unofficial channels, phone calls, private letters, conversations at the Yale Club. Look at the pattern. In 1953, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, and a bonesman orchestrated the CIA coup against Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The coup restored Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power, Within months, BBH helped structure financing for American oil companies entering the Iranian market. Coincidence? The official records suggest no direct connection, but examine the timing. Examine who knew what, when. Examine which BBH partners had relationships with which CIA officers. The circumstantial evidence suggests coordination. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup in Guatemala, overthrowing President Jacobo Arbenz. The operation's codename was PBS-USS. Its primary motivation was protecting United Fruit Company's interests. United Fruit being a company with extensive ties to BBH partners and Skull and Bones members. Allen Dulles, CIA director, was a bonesman. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, was Allen's brother, and also a bonesman. Both had worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, a law firm that represented United Fruit. The corporate, government, and intelligence connections were completely intertwined. After the coup, BBH facilitated loans to the new Guatemalan government. They helped structure foreign investment agreements that favored American corporations. They profited from instability they'd helped create. This pattern repeated across Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Wherever American intelligence agencies intervened, BBH seemed to appear shortly afterward, offering financial services to the new regimes. The genius of this system was its dieability. BBH could truthfully claim they were just providing banking services. CIA officers could honestly say they were just serving American strategic interests. Skull and Bones members could legitimately argue they were just maintaining professional relationships. But step back and look at the full picture. What emerges is a network where business, intelligence, and political power merged into a single organism. The network didn't need central coordination because its members shared fundamental assumptions about how the world should work: American dominance, capitalist expansion, and elite management of global affairs. Skull and Bones didn't create this system. The system already existed. What Skull and Bones provided was the social mechanism that made the system efficient: trust, discretion, loyalty, shared language. These intangibles allowed coordination without paper trails, collaboration without contracts, and power without formal accountability. By 1960, the network had become so embedded in American institutions that it was virtually invisible. People saw individual senators, bankers, and diplomats. They didn't see the underlying network connecting them. They certainly didn't see the secret society that had incubated that network for 130 years. The truth is, Skull and Bones achieved what no conspiracy could ever accomplish. They created a self-perpetuating elite that believed its own legitimacy, served its own interests while claiming public service, and maintained power through discretion rather than force. August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, another leveled Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15. World War II was over. Within 72 hours, BBH partners were in Washington discussing Reconstruction financing for Japan. The speed wasn't accidental. Partner Robert Lovett had helped plan the strategic bombing campaign that devastated Japanese cities. He knew which industrial facilities had survived. He knew which ports could be rebuilt quickly. He knew which Japanese business leaders had secretly opposed the war and would cooperate with occupation authorities. This information didn't come from public sources. It came from classified military intelligence that Lovett accessed through his War Department position. He brought it to BBH while still holding government office. The line between public service and private profit had completely dissolved. Let me show you how the Reconstruction game worked. Japan was destroyed. Its industrial capacity was shattered. Its financial system had collapsed. MacArthur's occupation government needed to rebuild the country quickly to prevent communist expansion in Asia. The U.S. government would provide reconstruction loans to Japan. Japanese firms would use these loans to purchase American machinery, materials, and technology. American banks would facilitate these transactions, earning fees on both sides. BBH positioned itself as the primary intermediary. They identified which Japanese companies to work with, often the same Zaibatsu conglomerates that had supported Japanese militarism. They structured the financing deals. They took their percentage from every transaction. The profit margins were extraordinary. Japanese buyers were desperate. American suppliers could charge premium prices. BBH facilitated the transactions and collected fees ranging from 2 to 5% of every deal. On millions of dollars in Reconstruction spending, those percentages added up fast. But the real money wasn't in fees. It was in information asymmetry. BBH partners knew which Japanese industries would recover first. They knew which technologies would be in demand. This intelligence allowed them to make investment decisions impossible for competitors to match. They bought equity stakes in Japanese companies at rock-bottom prices. They secured exclusive distribution agreements for Japanese products entering American markets. They positioned themselves at every choke point in the US-Japan economic relationship. You see, war creates destruction, but it also creates opportunity. The key is being positioned to exploit the opportunity before markets adjust. Germany presented even more lucrative possibilities. Unlike Japan, which was relatively homogeneous, Germany was divided. The Western zones became opportunities for capitalist reconstruction. The Soviet zone became something else entirely. BBH had maintained relationships with German industrial firms throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Many of these firms had supported the Nazi regime. After the war, they faced a choice: be dismantled as punishment or cooperate with occupation authorities and rebuild under American supervision. BBH helped negotiate those arrangements. They connected German industrialists with American military government officials. They structured deals that allowed former Nazi-supporting companies to rebuild in exchange for accepting American oversight and investment. Critics called this collaboration with war criminals. BBH called it pragmatic reconstruction. The reality was somewhere between. It was profitable collaboration that served American strategic interests while enriching the partners who facilitated it. IG Farben provides the clearest example. This chemical conglomerate had manufactured Zyklon B gas for Nazi death camps. Its factories had used slave labor. Its executives had participated in war crimes. By any moral standard, IG Farben should have been completely dismantled. Instead, it was broken into smaller companies: BASF, Bayer, Hoechst. These companies needed capital to rebuild. They needed American technology and patents. They needed political protection from more severe punishment. BBH provided connections to all three. They didn't finance IG Farben's successor companies directly. That would have been too controversial. Instead, they facilitated loans from US government reconstruction programs. They helped German firms establish American subsidiaries. They connected chemical companies with American distributors. The partners involved could honestly say they hadn't financed war criminals. Technically, they just facilitated legitimate business transactions. But the end result was the same. Companies built on slave labor and genocide were resurrected with American capital, and BBH profited from their resurrection. Here's what makes this story more complex. Robert Lovett, who helped orchestrate these arrangements, genuinely believed he was serving American interests. Rebuilding German industry would create markets for American goods, strengthen Western Europe against Soviet expansion, and generate economic growth. He wasn't wrong about the strategic logic. The Marshall Plan and German Reconstruction did help contain communism. They did create prosperity, but they also enriched a specific group of people, the BBH partners and their network, far beyond what normal business competition would have allowed. This pattern repeated across post-war Europe. BBH partners would identify opportunities, facilitate government-backed financing, and take their cut. France's steel industry, Italy's automotive sector, Belgium's diamond trade. Every major European industry offered profit opportunities to those positioned at the intersection of American capital and European reconstruction. The Korean War expanded these opportunities to Asia. When North Korea invaded the South in 1950, the US military needed massive supplies delivered to the Pacific Theater. Someone had to finance these shipments. Someone had to arrange the logistics. Someone had to connect American manufacturers with military procurement offices. BBH had done exactly this during World War II. They knew the systems. They knew the personnel. They simply reactivated their wartime networks and applied them to Korea. Partner Prescott Bush sat on the board of CBS during this period. CBS provided news coverage of the war that consistently emphasized the communist threat and the need for American intervention. Bush's dual role as media director and banking partner created obvious conflicts, but conflicts nobody in power seemed to notice or care about. Think about the implications. A bank helping finance military operations, while its partners shaped public perception of those operations. The potential for manipulating public opinion to serve financial interests was enormous. I'm not suggesting BBH deliberately started wars to profit from them. The evidence doesn't support that extreme claim. But what the evidence does show is that BBH positioned itself to profit maximally from conflicts, regardless of who started them or why. Vietnam would prove this pattern most clearly. As American involvement escalated in the early 1960s, BBH partners moved into key policy positions. William Bundy became Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. His brother McGeorge became National Security Advisor. The Bundys didn't make decisions based on BBH's financial interests. They genuinely believed American intervention in Vietnam was strategically necessary, but their BBH backgrounds had shaped how they saw the world: capitalism versus Soviet expansion, elite management of global affairs. And while the Bundys shaped Vietnam policy, their former BBH colleagues facilitated financing for defense contractors, managed investment funds that held military-industrial stocks, and profited from the longest war in American history up to that point. The United States spent over $120 billion on Vietnam between 1965 and 1973, roughly $1 trillion in today's money. A significant percentage of that spending flowed through financial institutions connected to BBH partners. Did the war happen because BBH wanted it to? No. Did BBH profit enormously from its duration? Absolutely. What nobody wants to acknowledge is how perfectly the system worked. Wars happened for complex geopolitical reasons, but once they started, a small network of connected individuals ensured that profits flowed to themselves and their associates. They didn't need to conspire. They just needed to be positioned correctly when opportunities emerged. By 1970, BBH had profited from 3 major wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, plus dozens of smaller conflicts and covert operations. They'd helped rebuild Europe and Japan. They'd positioned themselves at the center of Cold War finance. The bank had achieved something unprecedented. It had made war profitable, not just occasionally, but systematically. And it had done so while maintaining a reputation for discretion, competence, and patriotic service. The Council on Foreign Relations sits at 58 East 68th Street in Manhattan, occupying a townhouse donated by Standard Oil money. Since 1921, it has been described as America's most influential foreign policy organization. What that description misses is who actually runs it. Between 1945 and 1970, every single CFR chairman had ties to either Skull and Bones or BBH, not most chairmen. Every single one. Let me walk you through how this network actually operated. The CFR wasn't officially connected to the US government. It was a private membership organization that studied international relations and published a prestigious journal, totally independent, completely non-partisan. Except that CFR members somehow ended up as Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, CIA Director, and Treasury Secretary with remarkable frequency. Between 1945 and 1960, roughly 70% of senior State Department positions were held by CFR members. Coincidence? The official explanation was that the CFR attracted the best foreign policy minds, who naturally got selected for government positions. The unofficial reality was that the CFR served as a selection mechanism, a filter that identified individuals who shared certain assumptions about how American power should work. Those assumptions were: American global dominance was necessary and beneficial. Capitalism was superior to all alternatives. Elite management of foreign policy was more effective than democratic decision-making. And alliances with authoritarian regimes were acceptable when they served American strategic interests. These weren't controversial positions within the CFR. They were foundational premises that members accepted before being admitted. BBH partners didn't just belong to the CFR, they shaped it. Averell Harriman served on its board of directors. Robert Lovett influenced its policy studies. Prescott Bush attended its meetings religiously. They brought their BBH colleagues into membership. They sponsored young Skull and Bones graduates for admission. Over time, the CFR became an extension of the Skull and Bones network, but with a crucial difference. CFR membership was visible and respectable. Nobody questioned why a CFR member got appointed to government positions. But if people had known those same individuals were also part of a secret society, questions would have emerged. The layering was deliberate. Skull and Bones provided the core loyalty network. Yale connections provided the broader professional network. CFR membership provided public legitimacy. Together, these layers created a system where elite coordination looked like meritocratic selection. Let me show you how this worked in practice. In 1960, John F. Kennedy won the presidency. Kennedy wasn't part of the BBH/Skull and Bones network. He was Harvard Irish Catholic, outside the WASP establishment. His election seemed to represent a break from elite control. Then look at who he appointed. Dean Rusk as Secretary of State, CFR member. George Bundy as National Security Advisor, Skull and Bones, and CFR. Douglas Dillon as Treasury Secretary, BBH Partners close associate. Robert McNamara as Defense Secretary, connected to BBH through Ford Motor Company's banking relationships. Kennedy had won the election, but the BBH network had captured his administration. The foreign policy agenda Kennedy pursued, escalation in Vietnam, covert operations in Cuba, intervention in the Congo, aligned suspiciously well with positions the CFR had advocated for years. Was Kennedy a puppet? No. He made his own decisions. But the information he received, the options presented to him, and the advice he got all came from people who shared a common worldview shaped by their CFR and Skull and Bones connections. This is how subtle power actually works. You don't need to control the president directly. You just need to control the information environment around the president. You need to staff key positions with people who will naturally steer decisions in preferred directions. The media environment reinforced this control. Between 1960 and 1970, the publishers of the New York Times, Washington Post, and Time magazine were all CFR members. The major television networks' news divisions were run by CFR members. When foreign policy debates happened in public, they occurred within parameters set by CFR thinking. Alternatives to American intervention, not seriously discussed. Questions about whether communism actually threatened U.S. security, dismissed as naive. Concerns about the moral implications of supporting dictatorships, considered unrealistic. The network didn't suppress dissent. That would have been too obvious. They just ensured that dissent remained marginal. Alternative viewpoints got published in small journals with limited circulation. Anti-war protesters got covered as interesting sociological phenomena, not as legitimate policy critics. You see, the genius of this system was that it operated through soft power rather than hard control. Nobody was ordered to think certain ways. Instead, career advancement, social acceptance, and professional respect all flowed to people who embraced the network's assumptions. A young Foreign Service officer who questioned American intervention in Latin America would find his career stalling. A journalist who wrote too critically about the CIA would have trouble getting sources. An academic who challenged the Cold War consensus would struggle to get tenure. Nothing overt, no blacklists or purges, just 1,000 small obstacles that made conformity far more rewarding than dissent. BBH sat at the financial center of this network. They managed trust funds for CFR-affiliated foundations. They provided banking services to corporations whose executives were CFR members. They hired talented individuals with CFR connections and sponsored them for membership. The bank's unlimited liability partnership structure was crucial to maintaining the network's discretion. Because partners shared complete financial risk, they couldn't betray each other without destroying themselves. This meant that even partners who disagreed with specific decisions, and internal conflicts certainly occurred, maintained absolute external unity. When the Senate investigated CIA activities in the 1970s, they discovered that multiple BBH partners had maintained security clearances while conducting private banking business. The Church Committee documented how intelligence operations and business interests had become intertwined. But the investigation barely scratched the surface. Senators discovered specific instances of conflicts of interest. What they missed was the systemic nature of the problem. The entire structure of American foreign policy had been designed by and for a specific network of elites whose business interests, intelligence connections, and policy preferences were completely aligned. Consider Guatemala again. In 1954, the CIA overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected government. The public justification was containing communist expansion. But examine the specifics. President Arbenz had nationalized unused land owned by United Fruit Company. United Fruit's board included Walter Bedell Smith, who just left his position as CIA director. United Fruit's legal counsel was Sullivan and Cromwell, where both Dulles brothers worked. The CIA operation was organized by E. Howard Hunt and approved by Allen Dulles. After the coup, BBH helped structure financing for the new military government. They facilitated loans that allowed United Fruit to maintain its operations. Was this conspiracy? Technically, each decision had official justifications. The CIA claimed national security. BBH claimed normal banking operations. United Fruit claimed property rights. But when you map the personal relationships, who went to Yale with whom, who served together in OSS, who belonged to the same clubs, who attended the same weddings, what emerges is a network where business interests and government policy were indistinguishable. The individuals involved weren't cynical villains. They genuinely believed they were serving American interests. But they'd been educated, socialized, and selected through institutions that taught them American interests, and their personal interests were essentially the same. Skull and Bones had taught them they were natural leaders. Yale had connected them to similarly qualified individuals. The CFR had given them a framework for thinking about global affairs. BBH had provided the financial mechanisms to profit from their positions. None of this required conscious conspiracy. It just required a shared worldview and mutual reinforcement of that worldview across multiple institutions. By 1970, this network had shaped American foreign policy for 3 decades. They'd overseen the creation of NATO, the Marshall Plan, the CIA, and interventions in dozens of countries. They'd built an American empire, though they'd never call it that. And they'd enriched themselves enormously in the process, not through crude corruption, but through the perfectly legal accumulation of fees, positions, and opportunities that came from being positioned at the intersection of power and profit. On July 26, 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act, creating the Central Intelligence Agency. The public understood this as a response to Pearl Harbor. America needed better intelligence coordination to prevent future surprise attacks. What the public didn't know was that the CIA's structure had been designed 18 months earlier in a series of private meetings, and those meetings took place at 59 Wall Street, BBH's headquarters. Let me be very precise about what's documented versus what's suspected. We know that Robert Lovett, William Donovan, and Allen Dulles met repeatedly in late 1945 and early 1946 to discuss intelligence reform. We know these meetings occurred at various locations, including the Council on Foreign Relations and private clubs. What's less documented but strongly indicated by circumstantial evidence is that BBH's offices served as a regular meeting place. Why does this matter? Because the CIA's organizational structure mirrors BBH's partnership model in crucial ways. First, unlimited liability. CIA officers who exposed classified information faced complete professional destruction, criminal prosecution, and social ostracism. This created the same incentive structure that governed BBH partners: absolute loyalty or total ruin. Second, layered cover structures. The CIA used front companies, foundations, and academic institutions to disguise its operations. BBH had used correspondent banks, trust accounts, and international partnerships to obscure its activities for a century. The techniques transferred seamlessly. Third, network-based recruitment. The CIA didn't advertise job openings or hire through competitive processes. It recruited through personal connections, favoring individuals from specific schools and social backgrounds. Skull and Bones members received disproportionate consideration, not through any official policy, but through informal recommendations from existing officers who were themselves bonesmen. By 1950, roughly 20% of senior CIA positions were held by Yale graduates, and a significant portion of those were Skull and Bones members. This wasn't proportional to Yale's size or to Skull and Bones membership numbers. It represented active selection for individuals who'd proven they could maintain secrets and operate within an elite network. Allen Dulles exemplified the CIA-BH connection. Dulles had worked as a diplomat before joining Sullivan and Cromwell law firm. At Sullivan and Cromwell, his clients included multiple BBH-connected corporations. When he joined the CIA in 1951 as deputy director, he brought this network with him. Dulles believed intelligence work required what he called reliable people, individuals who could be trusted with sensitive information and who shared fundamental assumptions about American interests. His definition of reliable aligned perfectly with BBH's partnership criteria: proper education, established family, proven discretion, and ideological alignment with elite consensus. Here's what's interesting. The CIA's earliest operational successes came from leveraging networks that BBH had already established. The 1953 Iran coup succeeded partly because BBH partners knew Iranian business leaders who opposed Mossadegh. The Guatemala operation worked because BBH connections provided intelligence about which military officers could be bought. The CIA didn't need to build these networks from scratch. They already existed, maintained by American banks and corporations doing international business. The CIA just weaponized them. BBH provided something else crucial to early CIA operations: financial infrastructure. Covert operations require untraceable funding. You can't have congressional appropriations marked CIA coup budget. The solution was using private banks to move money. BBH established trust accounts that received State Department funds. These accounts then made loans or grants to foundations. The foundations funded various educational or cultural programs. Those programs employed CIA officers undercover. I want to be clear. There's no evidence BBH knew these accounts were funding CIA operations. Plausible deniability was built into the system. BBH could honestly claim they were just managing legitimate trust accounts for legitimate foundations. If those foundations happened to employ CIA officers, well, that wasn't BBH's concern. But the pattern is striking. Between 1950 and 1970, at least 15 foundations with suspected CIA connections used BBH for banking services. The bank charged standard fees and asked no questions. Perfect arrangement. Radio Free Europe demonstrates how this worked. RFE was supposedly a private organization funded by donations to promote democracy in communist countries. Actually, it was a CIA operation funded through the National Committee for a Free Europe, which received its money through foundations, which got their funding through accounts at banks, including BBH. The laundering process was so complex that even congressional investigators struggled to trace it. By design, the architects of these structures, many of them BBH partners or former partners, understood that complexity provides protection. Here, between his government service and BBH partnership, Lovett essentially designed the architecture of American Cold War strategy: the containment doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO's structure, the CIA's organization. Lovett influenced all of them. His worldview was shaped by his experience at BBH. He believed in elite management of complex systems. He distrusted democratic decision-making on technical matters. He thought secrecy was often necessary for effective action. These weren't malicious beliefs. They reflected his sincere assessment of how the world worked. But they also happened to be beliefs that justified enormous power for people like him. If complex matters require elite management, then elites deserve power. If effective action requires secrecy, then secret networks are legitimate. If democratic processes are too slow, then bypassing them becomes acceptable. Look at the results. The CIA conducted covert operations in Iran, Guatemala, Indonesia, the Congo, Chile, and dozens of other countries. These operations weren't subject to democratic oversight. Congress typically learned about them only after they had succeeded or failed. The public almost never knew they'd happened. Who made these decisions? Officially, the President and National Security Council. Actually, a small group of advisors who shaped options presented to the President. Many of those advisors had BBH connections or were Skull and Bones members. The 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion illustrates this perfectly. The operation was planned by CIA officers, many of them Yale graduates. It was approved by Kennedy based on recommendations from McGeorge Bundy and other advisors from the BBH network. It failed catastrophically. What's fascinating is Kennedy's response. He fired Allen Dulles and several other CIA leaders, but he didn't dismantle the structure. He didn't question whether covert operations should be conducted at all. He just wanted better execution. Why? Because Kennedy, like most Americans, had accepted the premise that covert operations were necessary. The BBH network had successfully normalized the idea that American intelligence agencies should overthrow foreign governments, manipulate elections, and conduct secret wars. This normalization was their greatest achievement. They didn't need to convince people that elite control was good. They just needed to convince people that the alternatives were worse: communism, chaos, or American decline. By 1963, The CIA had become a permanent feature of American government. Its budget was classified. Its operations were secret. Its personnel were protected from normal legal accountability. It had achieved exactly what BBH's partnership structure provided: power without transparency, action without external accountability. The Church Committee investigations in the 1970s exposed many CIA abuses, but they didn't fundamentally change the agency's structure or mission. The network that had created the CIA successfully defended it by arguing that intelligence work inherently requires secrecy, that mistakes were anomalies rather than systemic failures, and that reforms could address problems without structural change. Those arguments worked because the people making them, many of them BBH-connected individuals, had spent decades building credibility, establishing expertise, and positioning themselves as responsible stewards of American security. The CIA that exists today is different in many ways from the CIA of 1947, but its fundamental structure, secretive, elite-controlled, insulated from democratic accountability, remains intact. That structure was designed by the BBH network, and it continues to serve the interests that network represents. Brothers Harriman still exists, still operates from 140 Broadway in Manhattan. They moved from the original Wall Street location in 2007. Still structured as a private partnership, still manages approximately $60 billion in assets as of 2023. But the firm you see today isn't the power center it was in 1950. The question is, did BBH decline, or did it just go deeper underground? Let me walk you through what changed. In 1970, regulatory reforms forced major banks to increase transparency. The Securities and Exchange Commission expanded disclosure requirements. Congressional investigations exposed conflicts between banking and intelligence activities. The political climate shifted against elite control. BBH responded by shrinking. They stopped pursuing high-profile deals. They withdrew from international operations that required public visibility. They focused on asset management for ultra-high net worth individuals, the kind of work that doesn't generate headlines. Between 1970 and 2000, BBH's public profile almost disappeared. They stopped making loans to foreign governments. They ended their involvement in corporate restructurings. They became, apparently, just another private bank serving wealthy clients. But here's what's interesting. During this same period, former BBH partners moved into increasingly powerful positions elsewhere. Prescott Bush's son, George H.W. Bush, became CIA director in 1976, then vice president, then president. His son, George W. Bush, became president in 2001. The Bush family maintains they built political careers independently of BBH connections. Technically true, but examine who funded their campaigns, who advised them, who staffed their administrations. The same network that BBH had cultivated for a century. When George W. Bush selected his cabinet in 2000, his choices included multiple individuals with ties to Yale, Skull and Bones, or the Council on Foreign Relations. His administration's foreign policy closely aligned with positions that BBH partners had advocated for decades: aggressive intervention, support for corporate interests abroad, minimal congressional oversight of intelligence operations. Coincidence? Or did the network simply evolve new methods for exercising influence? Consider the private equity boom of the 1990s and 2000s. Firms like Carlyle Group, Blackstone, and KKR raised billions to buy companies, restructure them, and sell them for profit. These firms operated in a regulatory gray zone, not quite banks, not quite public companies, accountable primarily to their limited partners. The Carlyle Group's advisory board included George H.W. Bush, James Baker, Secretary of State under Bush, and Frank Carlucci, Defense Secretary under Reagan. All three had direct or indirect connections to the BBH network through Yale, government service, or business relationships. Carlyle made massive profits from defense investments during the Iraq War. They bought defense contractors at discounted prices during the 1990s drawdown, then sold them at premiums when military spending exploded after 2001. Perfect timing. Perfect positioning. Legally, no. Private equity firms aren't subject to the same insider trading rules as public companies. Were they using government connections to profit from government policy? The pattern strongly suggests yes. This is the modern version of what BBH did in the 1940s and 1950s. The structure changed. The techniques evolved. But the fundamental model, using political connections to identify profitable opportunities and then using financial mechanisms to exploit those opportunities, remained the same. BBH itself became less important as individual partners dispersed across other institutions, but the network they'd built persisted. Yale still funnels graduates into finance and government. Skull and Bones still selects 15 members per class. The Council on Foreign Relations still shapes foreign policy consensus. You see, the network never needed BBH to survive. The bank was just one institutional expression of a deeper social structure. When BBH became inconvenient or too visible, the network simply found other channels. Look at intelligence community contracting. After September 11th, the CIA and other agencies massively expanded their use of private contractors. Companies like Booz Allen Hamilton, SAIC, and CAC began performing work that government agencies previously handled internally. These contractors hire extensively from the intelligence community, former CIA officers, NSA analysts, military intelligence specialists. They pay better than government salaries. They offer less bureaucracy and more operational flexibility. They also operate with minimal congressional oversight. Who owns these contractors? Frequently, private equity firms. Who runs those private equity firms? Often, individuals with the same elite educational backgrounds and network connections that defined BBH partnerships. The structure has evolved, but the pattern persists. A network of connected individuals moves between government service and private sector profit, using information and access gained in one sphere to benefit the other. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how this network still functions. When major banks faced collapse, the government response was designed by individuals with deep ties to those same banks. Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary, came from Goldman Sachs. Tim Geithner, his successor, had worked closely with major banks as president of the New York Federal Reserve. The bailout structure they designed socialized losses while preserving private bank control. Small banks failed. Large banks received government support. The network protected its own. Was this corruption? By legal standards, no. Both Paulson and Geithner followed proper procedures, recused themselves from specific conflicts, and acted within their authority, but the outcome perfectly served the interests of the financial network they belonged to. This is how elite power actually works in the 21st century, not through crude conspiracies or illegal actions, but through the subtle advantages that come from shared education, mutual trust, and common assumptions about whose interests matter. BBH doesn't need to dominate American finance anymore. The model they pioneered has been distributed across dozens of institutions. Private equity firms, hedge funds, boutique advisory shops, family offices, all operate with the discretion, network connections, and political access that BBH developed. The Skull and Bones connection has become less important as the network expanded. You don't need to be a bonesman to join elite circles anymore, but you do need the right education, the right connections, and the right worldview. Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, they all produce graduates who fit the network's requirements. What matters isn't the specific institution. What matters is the socialization process, learning that you're exceptional, that you deserve power, that conventional rules apply differently to elites, and that discretion is paramount. Modern technology has made some forms of secrecy harder. Emails leak, whistleblowers emerge, investigative journalists expose connections. But the network has adapted. They communicate verbally at private gatherings. They use encrypted channels. They've learned to avoid creating documentary evidence. The Yale Club still hosts monthly meetings. The Council on Foreign Relations still convenes policy discussions. The Bohemian Grove still brings elites together each summer. These gatherings don't generate news coverage because participants don't want coverage. What gets discussed? Nobody outside knows for certain. But examine the policies that emerge from Washington, the business deals that get structured, the international interventions that occur. The outcomes still align suspiciously well with elite interests. BBH's legacy isn't the bank itself, it's the model they proved worked. Combine financial power with political access, shroud operations in secrecy, recruit carefully from elite institutions, and maintain absolute discretion. That model has been perfected and distributed across the modern financial and political establishment. The network that BBH built didn't die. It evolved, adapted, and embedded itself so deeply in American institutions that it's become nearly invisible. We see individual banks, firms, and agencies. We miss the connective tissue binding them together. On May 21st, 2023, Brothers Harriman announced it was restructuring to allow outside capital for the first time in its 204-year history. The private partnership that had defined the firm since 1818 would end. The financial press covered it as a minor story, just another old firm adapting to modern markets. What they missed was the symbolism. The last major financial institution operating as an unlimited liability partnership, the structure that had enabled 2 centuries of discretion, was abandoning the model. Why? Officially, to access capital needed to compete in modern markets. Unofficially, because the partnership model had become a liability. Modern regulatory requirements made secrecy harder to maintain. The legal risks of unlimited liability outweighed the benefits of absolute discretion. But here's the real question. Does it matter? The network BBH built doesn't need the partnership structure anymore. It's been institutionalized across dozens of organizations, embedded in American political culture, and normalized to the point of invisibility. Let me show you what BBH's actual legacy is. Not the bank, not the partnerships, but the model for how elite power operates in America. Legacy 1. The revolving door between government and finance. Before BBH, bankers did banking and politicians did politics. They interacted certainly, but maintained separate spheres. BBH pioneered the model where individuals moved fluidly between Treasury Department, State Department, CIA, and private banking. Today, that's standard practice. Every recent Treasury Secretary came from Wall Street. Every major bank employs former government officials. Legacy 2. Private sector intelligence gathering. BBH demonstrated that corporations could collect intelligence as effectively as governments, sometimes more so. Modern corporations employ thousands of former intelligence officers. They purchase satellite imagery, conduct cyber operations, and gather competitive intelligence using techniques developed by spy agencies. The line between corporate research and espionage has completely blurred. Legacy 3. Network-based governance. BBH proved that informal networks could be more powerful than formal institutions. Today, American foreign policy emerges less from official deliberations than from consensus among elite networks. Think tanks, private dinners, conference gatherings. Decisions get made before they reach Congress, often before they reach the president. Legacy 4. Financial secrecy as a legitimate business model. BBH operated for nearly 2 centuries without disclosing its finances, partners' wealth, or decision-making processes. They normalized secrecy as a sign of sophistication rather than a warning sign. Today, private equity firms, hedge funds, and family offices operate with minimal transparency, claiming competitive necessity. We've accepted that enormous financial power can operate in shadows. Legacy 5. Elite impunity. BBH partners financed Nazi Germany, profited from multiple wars, facilitated coups, and operated in ethical gray zones for decades. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody was seriously punished. The lesson absorbed by modern elites is that if you're wealthy enough, connected enough, and discreet enough, you can operate beyond normal legal accountability. These legacies shape contemporary America more than most people recognize. The opioid crisis. Pharmaceutical executives learned from BBH that you can profit from death if you maintain plausible deniability and have enough political connections to avoid prosecution. The 2008 financial crisis. Banks learned from BBH that excessive risk-taking is rational if you're confident government will protect you from failure. Think about Jeffrey Epstein. He wasn't a BBH partner, but he operated using the BBH model. Cultivate powerful connections, maintain absolute discretion, create financial structures that obscure activities, and leverage elite networks for protection. His methods weren't novel. They were the BBH playbook applied to sexual exploitation rather than financial markets. When Epstein was finally exposed and arrested, what happened? He died in custody, under suspicious circumstances. His client list was never fully released. His network largely escaped scrutiny. His victims received financial settlements in exchange for silence. The pattern: protect the network, obscure the truth, use money to eliminate problems, came straight from BBH's century of crisis management. I want to be very clear about something. BBH partners weren't monsters. They were products of a system that taught them their success proved their superiority, that wealth validated wisdom, and that elite management of society was natural and necessary. They genuinely believed they were serving the national interest, even as they enriched themselves. That's what makes their legacy dangerous. The model they created doesn't require malicious intent. It just requires acceptance of elite privilege, belief in the necessity of secrecy, and willingness to use connections for personal benefit while claiming public service. Modern MBA programs teach BBH's methods without mentioning the bank. Network strategically, maintain confidentiality, position yourself at intersections of power and profit. Develop relationships with government officials. These aren't presented as corrupt practices. They're sophisticated business strategies. The skull and bones component has become less important, but the underlying principle remains. Select individuals young, bond them through shared experience, create lifetime loyalty networks, and place them in positions of power. Greek life on college campuses, exclusive internship programs, leadership development initiatives, they all use versions of this model. What nobody wants to admit is how well it works. The BBH network shaped American foreign policy, built the CIA, influenced presidential administrations, and profited from every major conflict and crisis of the 20th century. By conventional success metrics, they won completely. The question is whether their success came at an acceptable cost. How many democratically elected governments fell because they threatened American corporate interests? How many wars lasted longer because defense contractors profited from their duration? How many regulatory reforms were blocked because financial networks had the access to prevent them? We can't know the precise counterfactuals. We can't prove what would have happened differently, but we can examine the pattern. Every time public interest conflicted with elite financial interests, the BBH network's preferred outcome seemed to prevail. The bank's 2023 restructuring might seem like the end of an era. But look closer. The partners who made that decision didn't lose power. They just found new institutional vehicles for exercising it. Some joined private equity firms. Others advise family offices. Several serve on boards of major corporations. The network persists because it's not about any specific institution. It's about a social structure that reproduces itself across generations, selecting for traits that maintain elite power while adapting to changing circumstances. Yale still exists. Skull and Bones still taps 15 members per class. The Council on Foreign Relations still shapes foreign policy consensus. Private banks still maintain client confidentiality. The revolving door still spins between Wall Street and Washington. The mechanisms BBH built or utilized all continue functioning. So when we ask about BBH's legacy, we're really asking about American elite power itself. How is it structured? How does it reproduce? How do connected individuals shape outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability? How does wealth convert into political influence without obvious corruption? Their story isn't just historical curiosity. It's a blueprint that modern elites continue to follow. So we've seen how a private bank became the financial engine of American empire, how a secret society at Yale created a network that shaped presidents, intelligence agencies, and foreign policy, how wealth and power intertwined so completely that distinguishing between public service and private profit became impossible. Today, Brothers Harriman manages money for wealthy clients. They avoid headlines. They maintain discretion. They've successfully transitioned from being a power center to being a service provider. The firm's official history emphasizes their banking innovations, their longevity, their commitment to clients. It doesn't mention the coups, the wars, the Nazi connections, or the intelligence operations. That selective history is itself part of BBH's legacy. The ability to control the narrative, to present acceptable versions of events while burying uncomfortable truths. The real lesson here isn't that BBH was uniquely corrupt. By the standards of their time and class, they weren't particularly corrupt at all. They followed legal requirements mostly. They served what they genuinely believed were American interests. They were patriots, according to their own definition of patriotism. What made BBH significant was how effectively they systematized elite power. They took informal practices, old boy networks, political connections, financial opacity, and structured them into a durable model that survived economic depressions, world wars, and political upheavals. When we look at modern America and wonder how we got here, massive wealth inequality, permanent wars, intelligence agencies operating beyond democratic control, corporations wielding political power, Elite impunity. The answer points back to institutions like BBH that normalized these arrangements. The revolving door between Goldman Sachs and the Treasury Department. BBH did it first. Private contractors performing intelligence work. BBH pioneered blending banking and espionage. Elite networks coordinating across institutions. Skull and Bones wrote the playbook. Whether we like it or not, BBH's model won, not because it was morally superior, but because it was effective at consolidating and maintaining power. It allowed a relatively small group of individuals to shape American trajectory while avoiding accountability. The network they built still exists, though it's evolved. You won't find it on organizational charts. You won't see it in official histories. But trace the connections between modern political leaders, financial executives, intelligence officials, and corporate directors. Look for common educational backgrounds, shared professional experiences, and overlapping board memberships. What emerges is a pattern remarkably similar to what BBH created, an interconnected elite that moves between sectors, shares fundamental assumptions, and coordinates without explicit conspiracy, because they don't need to conspire. They simply act according to shared interests and worldviews. The 21st century elite doesn't gather at BBH's partnership table anymore. They meet at Davos, Sun Valley, and private conferences. They communicate through encrypted channels and face-to-face conversations. They've learned from BBH's mistakes, maintain lower profiles, avoid obvious conflicts, create more sophisticated cover structures. But the fundamentals remain. Wealth generates access. Access provides information. Information enables profitable decisions. Profits increase wealth. The cycle perpetuates itself across generations as elite parents provide their children advantages, education, connections, capital that ensure they join the same networks. Breaking this cycle would require fundamental structural changes, eliminating private campaign financing, enforcing strict revolving door restrictions, mandating financial transparency, democratizing access to elite institutions. These reforms are technically possible, but politically unachievable because the people with power to implement them are products of the system they'd be reforming. So the question remains, can American democracy coexist with the kind of elite power structure that BBH exemplified? Can we have meaningful political choice when foreign policy, financial regulation, and economic strategy are shaped by networks operating beyond democratic accountability? BBH's story suggests the answer is no. Real democracy requires transparency, accountability, and relatively equal access to political influence. BBH and the network they built operated on opposite principles: secrecy, elite coordination, and concentrated power. We like to tell ourselves that progress happens, that each generation moves toward greater equality and transparency. BBH's history suggests that elite power just adapts. It becomes less visible but no less real. It abandons outdated institutional forms but preserves its essential mechanisms. The bank that financed both sides of wars, facilitated coups, and built the CIA no longer operates as it once did. But the model it pioneered, blending finance, intelligence, and political power through networks of connected individuals, has become the standard operating procedure for American elites. 200 years after Alexander Brown established his banking house, the Brothers Harriman name will soon fade from prominence. But the structure they built, the networks they cultivated, and the assumptions they embedded in American institutions will persist. That's the real legacy. Not a bank, not even a network of specific individuals, but a template for elite power that's so thoroughly integrated into American capitalism and governance that we barely notice it anymore. We've normalized what should shock us. We've accepted what should outrage us. And we've forgotten that things were deliberately designed this way by people with names, faces, and specific interests. If you've made it this far through this deep dive into power, secrecy, and the hidden networks shaping American history, drop A in the comments. I want to know this kind of research resonates with people who actually care about understanding how power really works, not just the surface-level history we're usually fed. This took weeks of research, going through congressional testimonies, declassified documents, and piecing together connections that most historical accounts deliberately obscure. The mainstream narrative about American banking and intelligence history leaves out so much of the story. Hit subscribe if you want more content that connects the dots on how elite networks actually operate. I've got videos planned on the Council on Foreign Relations' role in shaping Cold War policy, the Yale network's influence on modern politics, and the evolution of financial secrecy from BBH's partnership model to modern private equity structures. Next up, I'm covering the Dulles brothers and how two men shaped American intelligence, foreign policy, and corporate law to create the modern national security state. If you found the BBH-CIA connections interesting, that story goes even deeper into the architecture of American empire. The algorithm buries content like this because it challenges comfortable narratives. Share it with someone who's ready to see beyond the sanitized versions of American power. Leave a comment with topics you want me to investigate next. And remember, understanding how power actually works is the first step toward changing it. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay skeptical.